What happens when a chance encounter forces two strangers to confront their deepest biases? Dr. Angela Hayes, a successful African-American physician, hails a taxi on her way to an important medical conference. But the driver, Paul Mitchell, abruptly refuses her service, judging her based on the red MAGA hat she's wearing. This unexpected act of prejudice sparks a powerful chain of events, pushing both Angela and Paul to grapple with their assumptions, their pasts, and their capacity for growth. As Angela launches a groundbreaking mentorship program to foster empathy in her community, Paul embarks on his own journey of redemption, reconnecting with the people he once pushed away. The morning was alive with the symphony of a bustling city. Horns blared, conversations overlapped, and the occasional street performer's music weaved into the chaos of downtown Chicago. Angela Hayes stood on the corner of a busy intersection, her dark leather tote slung over one shoulder and a coffee cup clasped tightly in her hand. She glanced at her watch, the sleek gold face reading 8:15 a.m. She was running late, which for Angela was an uncommon occurrence. Angela's life was built on precision and preparation. At 38 years old, she was a respected physician specializing in internal medicine, balancing a demanding schedule with her passion for community outreach. Her days often began before sunrise and stretched long after sunset, but today was special. She was due to deliver a keynote speech at a major medical conference. It was an honor she had worked hard to achieve, and she knew her words would carry weight in a room full of peers and industry leaders. She adjusted her hat, a bold red cap bearing the slogan, "Make America Great Again." The hat was an unusual accessory for her, but she had chosen to wear it deliberately. Angela believed in freedom of expression and challenging assumptions. Though she had no strong political affiliations, the hat symbolized her belief in open dialogue and the importance of separating people from stereotypes. She wanted to make a statement about the complexity of identity, even in subtle ways. As a Black woman, Angela was no stranger to judgment or the weight of assumptions. Growing up on the South Side of Chicago, she had faced her share of challenges. Her parents had instilled in her the value of hard work and resilience, and she carried those lessons with her to this day. The hat was her way of sparking thought, even discomfort, in those around her, but today it would do far more than that. Angela raised her hand to hail a taxi, her breath puffing out in small clouds in the crisp morning air. A yellow cab pulled up to the curb, and she stepped forward, grateful for the driver's quick response. The driver, a white man in his early 50s with graying hair and a weathered face, rolled down the window just enough to speak. "Where are you headed?" he asked, his tone neutral but brisk. "The convention center on East Monroe, please," Angela replied, her voice calm and professional. The driver's eyes flicked up to meet hers, then down to the hat perched on her head. His expression changed instantly. His lips tightened, and a shadow crossed his face. Without a word, he shook his head. "Sorry, I can't take you," he said flatly. Angela blinked, caught off guard. "I don't understand. Why not?" The man hesitated, his gaze lingering on the red hat. "I don't want trouble," he muttered, his tone defensive. "You can find another cab." Angela felt a flush of heat rise to her face. "I am just trying to get to a conference," she said, keeping her tone steady despite the growing lump in her throat. "What kind of trouble do you think I would cause?" The driver avoided her gaze, his hands gripping the wheel tightly. "Look, lady, I have the right to refuse service. Please step away." Angela stared at him, her mind racing. Was this really happening? She felt the sting of rejection, not as a professional, not as a paying customer, but as a person. Slowly, she stepped back onto the sidewalk, the cab pulling away before she could say another word. The sidewalk felt colder beneath her feet as Angela stood there, trying to make sense of the interaction. People rushed past her, their faces a blur of indifference. She felt a pang of frustration, not just at the driver, but at the system of assumptions and divisions that made such encounters possible. She adjusted her hat out of defiance, her hand lingering on the brim as she took a steadying breath. Angela glanced at her watch again. She needed to move. Hailing another taxi would take time, and she could not afford to risk another refusal. She tapped on her phone and summoned a rideshare instead, relieved when the app confirmed a driver was only a few minutes away. As she waited, she couldn't stop the thoughts swirling in her head. Why had the driver assumed the worst? Did he see her as a caricature, defined by the hat rather than the person beneath it? Angela prided herself on her ability to rise above such judgments, but this felt different. It was personal, a direct affront that left her questioning whether her message of dialogue and understanding could ever truly cut through the noise of division. When her rideshare arrived, the driver, a young woman with bright eyes and a warm smile, greeted Angela without hesitation. The kindness in her tone was a balm to Angela's rattled nerves, but the incident with the taxi lingered in her mind. As the car navigated the crowded streets toward the convention center, Angela replayed the encounter in her thoughts, searching for answers that remained elusive. Angela arrived at the conference with just minutes to spare. The grand hall buzzed with energy as attendees milled about, greeting colleagues and preparing for the day's sessions. Angela pushed the morning's events aside, focusing instead on the task at hand. She took her place at the podium, adjusting the microphone as the audience settled. "Good morning," she began, her voice steady and clear. "It is an honor to stand before you today as we discuss the future of healthcare and the vital role each of us plays in shaping it." As she spoke, her confidence grew, her passion for the topic driving her words. She shared stories from her career, emphasizing the importance of empathy and inclusivity in medicine. Though her speech was well received, Angela couldn't help but think about the broader implications of her message. Did the world truly value empathy, or was it just a word we clung to in theory? When the session ended, Angela stepped away from the stage to mingle with attendees. She received praise and thoughtful questions, but one interaction stood out. A young woman approached her, a nervous but determined expression on her face. "Dr. Hayes," the woman said, her voice trembling slightly, "your speech really resonated with me. My uncle drives a taxi, and he's been struggling a lot lately. He talks about how hard it is to trust people, especially with how divided things feel these days. Hearing you talk about bridging divides, it gives me hope." Angela smiled, touched by the woman's earnestness. "Thank you," she replied. "It is not always easy to reach across those divides, but it is always worth trying." The woman nodded, her eyes shining with emotion. As she walked away, Angela felt a flicker of hope rekindle within her. Perhaps her message was reaching farther than she realized, planting seeds in places she couldn't yet see. That evening, Angela returned home to her apartment in Hyde Park, a cozy space filled with books, art, and the faint hum of jazz playing from her speakers. She sat by the window, watching the city lights flicker against the night sky. The events of the day replayed in her mind: the driver's rejection, the young woman's words, and her own lingering doubts. Angela leaned back in her chair, gazing at the red hat resting on the table. It was just fabric and thread, but it carried so much weight. She thought about the man in the taxi and wondered what had shaped his assumptions, what pain or fear had led him to push her away. She didn't have answers, but she resolved to keep searching. Angela believed in the power of connection, even when it felt out of reach. Tomorrow was another day, and she would face it with the same determination that had carried her through every challenge before. For now, though, she allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection, letting the music fill the room as the city buzzed softly in the distance. Paul Mitchell gripped the steering wheel of his yellow cab tightly as he navigated the labyrinthine streets of Chicago. The city had been his home for all 54 years of his life, and the cab had been his livelihood for nearly 3 decades. But these days, it felt less like a job and more like a battlefield. Every fare seemed like a potential threat argument over fares, disagreements about destinations, and the unspoken tensions that had grown sharper in recent years. The morning had started like any other. Paul had brewed his coffee in his small, one-bedroom apartment in Bridgeport, the neighborhood he had called home since his wife passed away 5 years ago. The apartment was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards or the muffled sound of a neighbor's TV. Too quiet sometimes. His daughter, Emily, had moved out years ago to start her own family, leaving Paul alone with his thoughts and the memories of better days. He'd left the apartment at dawn, slipping into the familiar rhythm of his work. But then came the woman in the red hat, the woman he couldn't quite forget. Paul's first instinct, when he saw the hat, had been discomfort. Over the years, that particular slogan had become a lightning rod for conflict, sparking heated arguments that often spilled onto social media or the evening news. And Paul, like many others, had grown weary of the noise. To him, the hat wasn't just a piece of clothing. It was a symbol of everything that seemed to divide people these days. When the woman approached his cab, he noticed the polished way she carried herself, the confident tone of her voice as she requested a ride. She looked professional, poised. But then he saw the hat, and every ounce of her composure vanished in his mind. His gut reaction had been swift and defensive. "Not today," he muttered under his breath. As the morning wore on, Paul found himself replaying the scene. He told himself he'd made the right choice. Fares, like her people who wanted to make a statement, brought nothing but trouble. But the more he thought about it, the more his excuses started to feel thin. She hadn't raised her voice or caused a scene. In fact, she'd been calm and measured, far more than many of his other passengers. So why had he been so quick to turn her away? Paul's phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. He parked his cab by a curb and checked the screen. It was a text from his niece, Jessica. "Uncle Paul, thought of you today. I went to a conference and heard this amazing doctor speak about building bridges. She talked about empathy and healing divides, reminded me of how you used to be before things got so tough. Miss you." Paul frowned, rereading the message. Jessica had always been a bright spot in his life. She was ambitious, kind, and endlessly optimistic, a stark contrast to his growing cynicism. He tapped out a quick reply, promising to catch up soon, but her words stayed with him. Later that evening, Paul sat in his small kitchen with a plate of reheated lasagna. He turned on the TV to fill the silence, but his mind drifted back to the woman in the red hat. He didn't know her name, but he could still picture her face, calm, expectant, and then hurt. Paul took a bite of his dinner but barely tasted it. He thought about the years he had spent driving this cab, the people he had met, the stories they had shared. For most of his career, he had prided himself on being someone passengers could talk to. Strangers from every walk of life had sat in his back seat, and he'd always tried to meet them with an open mind. But something had changed. The world had gotten louder, angrier, and Paul had built walls to protect himself. He stopped asking questions, stopped caring about their stories. The woman in the red hat wasn't the first person he had turned away lately, and he worried she wouldn't be the last. As the hours dragged on, Paul stared at the muted TV, the soundless images playing out like a distant dream. For the first time in a long time, he wondered if the problem wasn't the world outside his cab, but something inside himself. The next morning, Paul went about his routine, trying to push the thoughts aside. He picked up a few fares, an older couple heading to the airport, a college student rushing to class, but the nagging feeling wouldn't go away. By mid-afternoon, Paul found himself parked near the convention center, where the medical conference was still taking place. He didn't know why he had come back here, but he felt drawn to the area. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was curiosity. As he watched people stream out of the building, Paul noticed a young woman in a crisp business suit walking toward a rideshare car. It was Jessica. He honked the horn and waved, catching her attention. She jogged over, a bright smile lighting up her face. "Uncle Paul, "What are you doing here?" "Just working," Paul replied, forcing a smile. "What about you? Thought you were busy with your fancy conferences." Jessica laughed, opening the passenger door to chat for a moment. "I was. It was amazing, actually. The keynote speaker, Dr. Hayes, was incredible. She talked about how small acts of empathy can change everything." Paul froze. "Dr. Hayes?" he asked, his voice faltering. Jessica nodded eagerly. "Yes, she's brilliant. African-American woman, super accomplished. She shared this story about treating patients from all kinds of backgrounds and how important it is to approach everyone without judgment." Paul felt a strange tightness in his chest. Did she wear a red hat?" Jessica frowned in confusion, but nodded. "Yeah, actually. Kind of a bold choice, considering everything. But she explained it was to challenge assumptions. Pretty brave, if you ask me." Paul didn't reply. He watched as Jessica got into her ride share and waved goodbye, her energy unshaken by the burdens of the world. As she drove away, Paul leaned back in his seat, staring at the steering wheel. The woman he had refused to drive wasn't some provocateur trying to stir up trouble. She was a respected professional, trying to make a statement about understanding and connection, and he had failed to see her for who she truly was. For the first time in years, Paul felt a pang of shame he couldn't ignore. That night, Paul sat in his apartment, the silence heavier than usual. He thought about Jessica's words, about the kind of person he used to be. He'd always tried to be fair, to give people the benefit of the doubt. Somewhere along the way, he had lost that part of himself. But maybe, he thought, it wasn't too late to find it again. With a deep breath, Paul picked up his phone and searched for the name Dr. Angela Hayes. He didn't know what he would do next, but he knew one thing for certain. He had to make this right. The day after her keynote speech, Angela Hayes sat at her desk in her hospital office, the soft hum of her computer filling the room. Her phone buzzed intermittently with notifications from colleagues congratulating her on the speech. But Angela's thoughts lingered on something far removed from the applause and accolades. The encounter with the taxi driver was still fresh in her mind. Despite her best efforts, she could not shake the memory of his rejection or the look of mistrust on his face. It was not the first time Angela had felt judged by someone who did not take the time to know her, but this instance stung differently. Her office was a modest but inviting space, adorned with photos of her parents and siblings, a few framed medical degrees, and a small shelf stacked with books on healthcare equity and cultural humility. It reflected her values, simple, purposeful, and rooted in a desire to make the world better. Angela leaned back in her chair and glanced at the red hat sitting on the corner of her desk. It had become a quiet symbol of her personal mission, to challenge the world to see people beyond the surface. But yesterday's encounter made her wonder if her approach was working or if it was only stirring up more misunderstandings. Her assistant knocked gently on the open door, snapping Angela out of her thoughts. "Dr. Hayes, you have a visitor," she said, her tone curious. "He says his name is Paul Mitchell." Angela frowned slightly, the name unfamiliar. "Did he say what he wanted?" Her assistant shook her head. "No, but he seems earnest. Should I send him away?" Angela hesitated for a moment, then shook her head. "No, it is fine. Let him in." A few minutes later, Paul walked into her office, hat in hand, literally. He looked nervous, his posture slightly hunched as though he were bracing for rejection. He had spent hours working up the courage to come here after finding Angela's contact information online, unsure if he would even be allowed to see her. Angela studied him for a moment. He looked familiar, but she couldn't immediately place him. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, gesturing toward a chair. "How can I help you?" Paul sat down, clutching his hat tightly. For a moment, he struggled to find the right words, his voice catching in his throat. Finally, he spoke. "Dr. Hayes," he began, his tone earnest, "I owe you an apology. Angela raised an eyebrow, intrigued but cautious. You don't know me, Paul continued, but I was the taxi driver who refused to give you a ride yesterday. Angela froze, her expression unreadable. Memories of the encounter flooded back, along with the frustration and hurt she had worked so hard to set aside. Paul hesitated, visibly uncomfortable. I judged you. I saw the hat, and I thought you were someone trying to cause trouble. I let my assumptions get the better of me, and I turned you away without even trying to understand. Angela remained silent, her gaze steady, but not unkind. She could see the genuine remorse in his eyes, the weight of guilt etched into his expression. I was wrong, Paul continued, his voice breaking slightly. I don't know why I let my fear and anger get in the way. That's not the kind of person I want to be. I came here because I needed to say I'm sorry. You didn't deserve that. Angela let his words settle in the air for a moment, her emotions swirling. She had imagined this man as hardened and unrepentant, but here he was, offering her the kind of vulnerability that took real courage. Thank you for coming, she said finally, her tone measured. It takes a lot to admit when we are wrong. Paul nodded, relief flickering across his face. Tell me something, Mr. Mitchell, Angela said, leaning forward slightly. Why did you feel the need to turn me away? What was it about the hat that made you assume the worst? Paul sighed deeply, staring down at the hat in his hands. It's complicated, he said. That hat, it reminds me of a time when everything felt so divided. I lost someone close to me in a protest a few years back, and ever since, I've had a hard time separating people from the symbols they wear. Angela softened slightly, hearing the pain in his voice. That doesn't excuse what I did, Paul added quickly. But I guess I just got used to seeing the world in black and white. I forgot that people are more complicated than that. Angela nodded slowly, understanding beginning to take root. She could see now that his actions, while hurtful, were rooted in fear and grief rather than malice. Mr. Mitchell, Angela said after a long pause, you are right. People are complicated. And it is easy to let our experiences shape the way we see the world, even when it leads us to make mistakes. Paul looked up at her, surprised by her calm tone. I wore that hat, Angela continued, her voice steady, because I believe in challenging assumptions, my own and others. I wanted to see how people would react, and maybe spark some reflection, but I never imagined it would lead to a moment like this. She gave him a small, thoughtful smile. We both have something to learn from this, don't we? Paul nodded, his grip on the hat loosening. Yeah, I guess we do. The two sat in silence for a moment, the tension in the room giving way to something lighter. Angela could feel a shift within herself, a release of the frustration she had carried since the encounter. She realized that this man was not just her antagonist, but also someone trying to navigate his own pain, just as she was. I appreciate your apology, Angela said finally. It means a lot, and I hope this experience helps both of us move forward with a little more understanding. Paul stood, gratitude evident in his posture. Thank you, Dr. Hayes, for giving me the chance to make this right. As he left her office, Angela watched him go, a sense of closure settling over her. The morning's bitterness had been replaced by something unexpected. Hope. That evening, Angela sat by her window, the red hat resting in her lap. She thought about Paul's visit, about the courage it took for him to face her and acknowledge his mistake. She realized that while the hat had sparked discomfort, it had also led to a moment of connection that felt genuine and meaningful. For the first time in days, Angela felt a sense of peace. She didn't have all the answers, but she knew this. Growth often came in the most unlikely ways. Angela Hayes stepped out of her apartment building the next morning, her tote bag slung over her shoulder and the red hat carefully tucked inside. She had spent the previous night reflecting on Paul's apology, feeling both the weight of its sincerity and the relief it had brought her. There was something deeply human in his effort to make amends, a reminder that people were capable of growth, even when they stumbled. Today, Angela had a busy schedule. Her morning rounds at the hospital were followed by an outreach event at a community health center where she was mentoring young medical students. It was work she loved, but the long hours often left her drained. As she climbed into her car, a 10-year-old sedan that had seen better days, she took a deep breath, mentally preparing herself for the day ahead. She turned the key in the ignition, but instead of the familiar hum of the engine, there was only a faint clicking sound. Angela frowned, trying again. The clicking continued, the engine refusing to turn over. "Great," she muttered under her breath, leaning back against the seat. She checked her watch, barely enough time to make it to the hospital on schedule. Angela popped the hood and got out of the car, staring at the engine as though sheer willpower could coax it back to life. Cars zipped by on the busy street, their drivers too focused on their own destinations to notice her predicament. She tapped on her phone, searching for a nearby tow service, but her frustration grew as the minutes ticked away. "Need some help?" a voice called out. Angela turned to see a young woman approaching, dressed in casual jeans and a flannel shirt. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a loose ponytail, and she carried a cheerful, unhurried air that contrasted sharply with Angela's rising anxiety. "I think my battery's dead," Angela said, forcing a polite smile. "I've called for roadside assistance, but they might take a while." The woman shrugged and smiled. "Well, lucky for you, I have jumper cables in my trunk. Let's see if we can get you going." Over the next few minutes, the woman who introduced herself as Carly worked with Angela to connect the jumper cables between their cars. Carly chatted casually as they worked, asking Angela about her day and sharing snippets of her own life. Angela learned that Carly was a freelance graphic designer who loved helping people, even if it was something as small as jump-starting a stranger's car. "Okay, try it now," Carly said, stepping back after connecting the cables. Angela climbed back into the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine sputtered, then roared to life. She exhaled in relief, a genuine smile spreading across her face. "Thank you so much," Angela said, stepping out of the car. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Carly waved her off. "No big deal. Everyone needs a little help now and then. Pay it forward when you get the chance, okay?" Angela nodded, her heart warming at the simple but profound gesture. "I will. And thank you again, Carly. You have no idea how much this means to me." As Angela drove to the hospital, her thoughts lingered on Carly's kindness. The encounter was a stark contrast to the experience with the taxi driver, and it reminded Angela that not everyone made snap judgments or allowed biases to dictate their actions. Carly's willingness to help a stranger without hesitation was a beacon of hope in a world that often felt divided. When Angela arrived at the hospital, she carried that sense of hope with her. She moved through her rounds with renewed energy, greeting patients and colleagues with warmth. Her work often involved navigating the complexities of human behavior, patients who were scared, staff who were overworked, and families who carried the weight of uncertainty. Today, she felt better equipped to meet those challenges with compassion. Later that afternoon, Angela arrived at the community health center. The center was located in a low-income neighborhood, and its mission was to provide accessible health care to underserved populations. Angela had been volunteering there for years, mentoring students and treating patients who couldn't afford care elsewhere. The students she worked with were eager and bright, but many of them carried their own burdens, financial struggles, family responsibilities, or the pressure of being the first in their families to pursue higher education. Angela saw herself in them, remembering her own journey and the mentors who had guided her along the way. As the students gathered in the conference room for their weekly discussion, Angela shared a story about her early days in medical school, When she had doubted her ability to succeed, she spoke candidly about the challenges she had faced and the people who had supported her, emphasizing the importance of resilience and community. "Remember," Angela said, her voice steady but kind, "no one gets through this journey alone. Whether it is a colleague, a mentor, or even a stranger, the connections you build along the way will make all the difference." One of the students, a young man named Malik, raised his hand. "Dr. Hayes, can I ask you something?" "Of course," Angela said, nodding toward him. "How do you deal with people who judge you before they know you? I feel like no matter how hard I work, some people just see me as a statistic." Angela paused, her heart aching at the question. Malik's words struck a chord, echoing her own feelings from the taxi encounter. "It's not easy," she admitted, "but what I've learned is that people's judgments often have more to do with their own fears and biases than with you. You can't control how others see you, but you can control how you respond. Lead with kindness and integrity, and let your actions speak louder than their assumptions." Malik nodded thoughtfully, and Angela saw a flicker of determination in his eyes. She hoped her words had given him a sense of agency, even in the face of prejudice. As the day wound down, Angela reflected on the unexpected twists it had taken. Carly's act of kindness, the student's eagerness to learn, and Malik's heartfelt question all reminded her of the interconnectedness of people's lives. Every action, no matter how small, had the potential to ripple outward, shaping the experiences of others in ways she might never see. Back at home, Angela placed the red hat on her bookshelf, letting it sit as a quiet reminder of the lessons she was learning. The world was complicated, and people were flawed, but moments of connection like Carly stopping to help or Paul coming to apologize proved that there was always room for growth and understanding. Angela took a deep breath and smiled to herself. She had made it through another day, and though the road ahead was uncertain, she felt ready to keep moving forward. After all, every challenge carried the seed of an opportunity, and she was determined to nurture it. Paul Mitchell sat in his cab, parked on a quiet side street near the edge of the city, staring at his phone. He had searched for Angela Hayes again, unsure of what he hoped to find. The online articles about her keynote speech had painted her as a compassionate and forward-thinking leader, someone who championed the kind of inclusivity he had failed to offer her that morning outside his cab. He rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of regret settle over him like a heavy blanket. Paul wasn't the kind of man to make excuses for himself. He had spent too many years raising his daughter alone, facing life's challenges head-on without complaint. But his decision to turn Angela away haunted him, especially after their conversation in her office. That conversation had been difficult, but cathartic. Paul had walked into her office ready to apologize and walked out with something he hadn't expected: clarity. Angela had listened to him without judgment, showing him a kind of grace he hadn't deserved. For the rest of that day, he had replayed her words in his mind. People are complicated, and it is easy to let our experiences shape the way we see the world. Paul had spent years letting his experiences cloud his judgment. He thought back to the protest that had taken his younger brother Mike. It was supposed to be a peaceful demonstration, but things had escalated, and Mike had been caught in the chaos. Paul's grief had hardened into bitterness, and over time, that bitterness had transformed into a defensive shell. But now, sitting alone in his cab, Paul began to realize how much of the world he had shut out because of that shell. He thought about the woman he had turned away, not as the symbol he had projected onto her, but as a person, a doctor, a leader, and someone who had undoubtedly faced her own struggles. Paul's phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a text from Jessica, his niece. "Uncle Paul, we're having dinner tomorrow night at Mom's. You should come. Everyone misses you." Paul smiled faintly at the screen. Jessica was one of the few people who still tried to include him, even when he kept his distance. He hesitated, then typed a quick reply. "I'll be there." The next evening, Paul arrived at his sister's house, the smell of roast chicken wafting through the open door as he stepped inside. Jessica greeted him with a hug, her bright energy filling the room. "I'm so glad you came," she said, leading him into the dining room where the family had gathered. As they ate, the conversation turned to Jessica's work in healthcare. She spoke passionately about the need for empathy and understanding in her field, echoing many of the ideas Paul had heard in Angela's speech. "Dr. Hayes really inspired me," Jessica said, her eyes lighting up. She talked about how small actions can create big changes. "It made me think about how we treat people every day, even in little ways. You never know how much a moment of kindness can mean to someone." Paul nodded, his appetite forgotten. Her words brought back memories of his conversation with Angela and the nagging feeling that he hadn't done enough to make things right. After dinner, Paul pulled Jessica aside as the family mingled in the living room. "Jess," he said, his tone serious, "do you think people can really change? Like, for good?" Jessica frowned slightly, caught off guard by the question. "Of course," she said after a moment. "I mean, look at Dr. Hayes. She's out there changing people's minds every day, just by being herself." Paul nodded, his gaze distant. "I made a mistake, Jessie, a big one. And I'm trying to fix it, but I don't know if it's enough." Jessica placed a hand on his arm, her expression softening. "The fact that you're trying means something, Uncle Paul. You can't undo the past, but you can decide what kind of person you want to be moving forward." Her words stayed with Paul long after he left her house that night. As he drove home, the city lights casting fleeting shadows across his dashboard, he thought about the kind of person he wanted to be. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing for certain. It was time to stop letting fear and anger dictate his choices. The next morning, Paul decided to take a different route with his cab. Instead of heading downtown, he drove toward the neighborhoods he had avoided for years, areas he had dismissed as too much trouble, but that were home to people just trying to live their lives like anyone else. His first fare of the day was a young mother with 2 small children. Heading to a doctor's appointment, she smiled gratefully as he helped her load her stroller into the trunk. "Thank you so much," she said, as she buckled her kids into the back seat. Paul smiled back, something genuine in the gesture. "No problem. Take your time." As they drove, the mother chatted about her kids, her work, and the challenges of balancing everything on her own. Paul listened, nodding occasionally, and felt a quiet sense of connection growing between them. When they arrived at the clinic, Paul helped her unload the stroller and watched as she walked inside, her children's laughter ringing out behind her. Over the next few days, Paul found himself seeking out opportunities to engage with people in ways he hadn't before. He tried to strike up conversations, to listen without judgment, and to see his passengers as individuals rather than assumptions. It wasn't always easy. Old habits and prejudices crept in at times, but Paul reminded himself of Angela's words and Jessica's encouragement. Change was a process, and he was willing to put in the work. By the end of the week, Paul found himself parked outside the community health center where Angela volunteered. He wasn't sure what had brought him here, but something about the place felt significant. As he sat in his cab, watching people come and go, he noticed a young man hesitating at the entrance, holding a clipboard. The man seemed nervous, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. Paul rolled down his window and called out, "You okay there, buddy?" The man looked up, startled, then nodded. "Yeah, just first day volunteering here. Guess I'm a little nervous." Paul smiled faintly. "You'll do fine. Just remember, it's about people, not perfection. Be yourself, and you'll be all right." The young man smiled back, his posture relaxing slightly. "Thanks. I needed that." As the man walked into the center, Paul leaned back in his seat, a sense of calm washing over him. For the first time in years, he felt like he was moving in the right direction. Angela's Friday morning started like most others early. The sun had barely risen when she finished her second cup of coffee and slipped on her jacket. She had a full day ahead, beginning with a meeting at the community health center. The red hat rested on a shelf near her door, untouched for days. While it symbolized resilience and the courage to face bias, Angela found herself questioning whether it truly served her message. The encounter with Paul had taught her that symbols, no matter how benign their intent, often carried unintended weight. As she stepped outside, the crisp morning air greeted her. She hailed a rideshare, opting to leave her unreliable car behind for the day. The city buzzed around her as she watched pedestrians hurry past, their lives unfolding in fragmented moments that hinted at untold stories. The car pulled up, and Angela climbed in, offering the driver a polite smile. As the vehicle navigated the busy streets, her mind wandered to her responsibilities at the health center. There were new volunteers to mentor and patients to see, but more than that, she wanted to discuss starting a new initiative focused on building bridges between staff and the communities they served. Angela felt hopeful but cautious. She had always believed in change, but she knew it took more than good intentions. It required patience, understanding, and consistency. Meanwhile, Paul was starting his day in his usual way, cruising the streets in his cab and scanning for fares. But something was different now. Since his apology to Angela, he had begun to notice how much of his job was about connection. His passengers weren't just names on a fare meter. They were people, each with a story, each deserving of kindness. When Paul picked up his first fare, a nurse heading to the hospital, he listened to her talk about the long hours and emotional toll of her work. He offered encouraging words, feeling a flicker of pride as she smiled and thanked him. Later that afternoon, fate intervened. Angela had just finished her meeting at the health center and was running late for another appointment across town. The rideshare she had called canceled unexpectedly, and she found herself standing on the curb, frustration creeping in. Without much thought, she stepped toward a nearby cab parked under the shade of a tree. Paul saw her approaching before she recognized him. His stomach tightened, and for a moment he considered driving away. But then he remembered their conversation, the apology, her calmness, the grace she had shown him. This was his chance to show he had learned from that moment. Angela opened the door and climbed in, glancing up as she gave her destination. Their eyes met, and a flash of recognition passed between them. "You," Angela said, her tone measured but unmistakably surprised. Paul swallowed hard, gripping the wheel. "Dr. Hayes," he said, nodding. I didn't expect to see you again." "Neither did I," Angela replied, her gaze steady. For a moment, silence filled the cab. The city moved around them in a blur of motion, but inside the car, time seemed to slow. Finally, Paul broke the silence. "I want you to know," he said, his voice low but firm. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened that day, about what you said, and I've been trying to do better." Angela tilted her head, curiosity softening her expression. "What does doing better look like for you, Mr. Mitchell?" Paul took a deep breath, keeping his eyes on the road. "It's small things," he admitted. "Talking to people instead of making assumptions. Listening more. Trying to see the person, not whatever I've decided they represent. It's not always easy, but I'm working on it." Angela nodded slowly, her gaze thoughtful. "Change is never easy," she said, "but it sounds like you're making an effort, and that's a good start." As they drove, the conversation flowed naturally. Paul spoke about his late brother, Mike, and how his loss had shaped his outlook. He explained how fear had seeped into his life, influencing decisions he barely recognized as his own. Angela listened intently, offering words of encouragement, but also gently challenging him to dig deeper. "Fear is powerful," she said, "but it doesn't have to control you. We all have the capacity to choose something different, even when it's uncomfortable." Paul nodded, her words resonating in a way that felt both profound and personal. "I'm trying," he said simply. Angela offered him a small, encouraging smile. That's all anyone can do. When they arrived at her destination, Angela hesitated before stepping out of the cab. She turned to Paul, her expression softer than it had been when she first recognized him. "Thank you for the ride, Mr. Mitchell," she said, "and for the conversation. It's clear you're putting in the work, and that matters." Paul smiled, a genuine warmth behind it. "Thank you, Dr. Hayes, for giving me another chance." Angela nodded, then stepped onto the sidewalk, disappearing into the crowd. Paul sat in his cab for a moment, the engine idling, as he processed what had just happened. For the first time in a long while, he felt something close to peace. Angela's afternoon passed in a blur of meetings and appointments, but the encounter with Paul lingered in her mind. She had seen something in him, a genuine desire to grow, to move beyond the limitations of his past. It reminded her that people were capable of change, even when it seemed unlikely. That evening, as she sat in her apartment, Angela pulled the red hat from the shelf and held it in her hands. The hat had sparked conflict, reflection, and growth, not just for her, but for Paul as well. It was a symbol of something greater than herself, a reminder that assumptions could be challenged and connections could be forged in unexpected places. Placing the hat back on the shelf, Angela felt a renewed sense of purpose. Her journey was far from over, but encounters like the one with Paul reminded her why it was worth continuing. Angela Hayes sat at her dining table late that evening, the warm glow of a single lamp illuminating the stack of notes and proposals spread before her. Her mind was restless, replaying the conversation she had with Paul earlier in the day. His vulnerability and sincere effort to grow had stirred something within her, a reminder of why she had chosen to become a physician, mentor, and advocate in the first place. People were not static. They were capable of remarkable growth, but only if given the chance and the tools to do so. Angela felt compelled to act. She had spent so much time addressing systemic issues, yet moments like today showed her that real change also required personal connection, one individual at a time. Reaching for her notebook, she began drafting an idea that had been taking shape in her mind for weeks, a mentorship program at the community health center. The goal would be simple but impactful, pairing medical staff and students with members of the community to foster understanding, trust, and collaboration. The next morning, Angela presented her idea at a staff meeting. The health center director, a pragmatic but supportive woman named Diana, listened carefully as Angela outlined her vision. "We already provide health care to underserved communities," Angela said, her tone confident but earnest. "But this program could take things a step further. By creating opportunities for dialogue and mentorship, we can break down barriers between the people we serve and those providing care. It's about building relationships, not just delivering services." Diana nodded, her expression thoughtful. "It's an ambitious idea," she said, "but it has potential. Let's start small, maybe with a pilot program. If it works, we can expand." Angela's heart lifted. "Thank you. I think this could make a real difference." That afternoon, Angela met with Malik, the young medical student she had mentored for months. She shared the news about the program, her excitement evident. "That sounds amazing," Malik said, his eyes bright with enthusiasm. "What made you think of it?" Angela hesitated, then smiled softly. "A series of encounters," she said, "and a reminder that connection is the foundation of understanding." Meanwhile, Paul Mitchell had begun to see his work in a new light. After his second encounter with Angela, he felt a sense of resolve he hadn't experienced in years. Driving his cab wasn't just a job, it was an opportunity to engage with people, to challenge his own assumptions, and to rebuild the bridges he had let crumble over time. One afternoon, he picked up an elderly man who had just come from the hospital. As they drove, the man shared stories about his life, his family, and his time in the Navy. Paul listened attentively, nodding and asking thoughtful questions. By the time they reached the man's destination, both were smiling. "Thank you for the ride," the man said, his voice warm. "You're a good listener." Paul felt a quiet pride in the compliment, knowing it reflected the changes he was trying to make. That evening, Paul decided to visit Jessica at her apartment. She welcomed him in, surprised but pleased to see him. Over cups of tea, Paul told her about his recent conversations with passengers and his encounters with Angela. "She's remarkable," Paul admitted. "She has this way of making you think, of holding up a mirror without making you feel small. I don't know how she does it." Jessica smiled knowingly. "People like her don't come around often, Uncle Paul, but the fact that you're listening and learning, that's what matters." Paul nodded, her words filling him with a renewed sense of purpose. A week later, Angela's mentorship program officially launched at the Community Health Center. The pilot group consisted of 5 staff members, 5 students, and 5 community members. Angela facilitated the first meeting, guiding the participants through introductions and icebreaker activities designed to encourage openness. Among the community members was a single mother named Sharon, a local shop owner named Miguel, and a retired teacher named Linda. Each brought unique perspectives and experiences, and as they began sharing their stories, Angela felt a spark of hope. "Programs like this are about more than just learning," Angela said as the meeting concluded. "They're about seeing each other, truly seeing each other, and recognizing the humanity we all share." One day, as the program gained momentum, Angela received an unexpected call from Paul. "Dr. Hayes," he began hesitantly, "I hope I'm not bothering you, but I heard about the program you started. I was wondering if there's any way I could help." Angela was surprised but touched by the offer. "Actually, we could use someone with your experience," she said after a moment. "Transportation is a big barrier for some of our community members. If you're interested, we could explore ways to involve you." Paul agreed immediately, his voice filled with determination. "I'd like that. Thank you." In the weeks that followed, Paul began volunteering his time to provide free transportation for mentorship participants who needed it. He ferried people to and from the health center, often engaging them in meaningful conversations during the rides. One afternoon he drove Sharon, the single mother, to the center. As they talked, Sharon shared her struggles juggling work, childcare, and her health. "You've got a lot on your plate," Paul said, his tone empathetic. "But it sounds like you're doing everything you can for your kids. That's something to be proud of." Sharon smiled, her eyes brightening. "Thank you. That means a lot." For Paul, these moments were more than just exchanges. They were reminders of the power of connection and the value of seeing people as individuals. Angela watched the program flourish with a sense of pride and gratitude. Participants began forming bonds that extended beyond the scheduled sessions. Sharon started babysitting for one of the students, Miguel offered discounts at his shop to staff members, and Linda began tutoring children in the neighborhood. One afternoon, as Angela observed a group discussion, Paul walked in to drop off a participant. Their eyes met, and Angela smiled. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, gesturing for him to join. "Why don't you stay for the session?" Paul hesitated but nodded, taking a seat at the edge of the group. As the discussion unfolded, he listened intently, absorbing the stories and perspectives being shared. By the end of the session, he felt a profound sense of belonging. That evening, Angela and Paul spoke as the center emptied out. "You've come a long way, Mr. Mitchell," Angela said, her voice warm. "Your willingness to be part of this, to give your time and energy, makes a difference." Paul nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "It's people like you who inspire it, Dr. Hayes. You've taught me more than I can say." Angela looked at him thoughtfully. "We've both learned something from each other, I think. And that's how it should be." As they parted ways, both felt the quiet satisfaction that came from knowing they were part of something larger than themselves, a movement toward understanding, empathy, and connection. The mentorship program at the Community Health Center was blossoming into something far greater than Angela Hayes had initially envisioned. What had begun as a small pilot project was now creating ripples throughout the community. Bonds were forming across divides, and the participants, whether they were patients, staff, or volunteers, were finding new ways to support one another. Angela had spent months balancing her work at the hospital with her time at the health center, but the rewards far outweighed the effort. She saw the impact of the program in the smiles of the participants, the shared laughter during group sessions, and the quiet moments of understanding when someone felt truly seen. Paul Mitchell was a central part of this transformation. As a volunteer driver, he had become more than just a facilitator of transportation. He was a trusted confidant for many of the participants. His conversations during the rides were genuine and open, and his willingness to share his own journey often encouraged others to do the same. One afternoon, Angela arrived at the health center to find Paul sitting on a bench outside, chatting with Miguel, the shop owner who had joined the program. Miguel had a notebook open, jotting down ideas as Paul spoke. "What's this about?" Angela asked, smiling as she approached. Miguel looked up, his face lighting up. "Paul's helping me brainstorm ways to make my shop more accessible to older customers. We were talking about how some people feel left out because they can't get around as easily." Angela raised an eyebrow, impressed. "That's a great idea. Accessibility can make a huge difference." Paul shrugged, his modesty apparent. "Miguel's the one doing the work. I just shared a few stories from my time driving seniors around." Angela took a seat beside them, feeling a sense of pride in how the program had evolved. "This is exactly what I hoped for," she said. "People connecting, sharing ideas, and making things better for everyone." Inside the health center, Sharon was leading a small group of participants in a workshop on time management. As a single mother juggling multiple responsibilities, she had become something of an expert on balancing priorities, and Angela had encouraged her to share her strategies with others. Linda, the retired teacher, watched from the back of the room, her face glowing with admiration. She leaned over to Angela, who had just joined her. "Do you see how confident she's become?" Linda whispered. "When Sharon first joined, she barely spoke. Now she's leading a class." Angela nodded, her heart swelling with pride. "That's the power of being seen and valued. Everyone has something to offer when they're given the chance." Later that evening, Paul dropped off his final passenger, a medical student named Priya, who had been paired with Linda for mentorship. As Priya stepped out of the cab, she turned back to Paul. "Thank you for listening," she said. "I didn't realize how much I needed to talk about everything I've been juggling." Paul smiled. "Sometimes, saying it out loud helps you see it more clearly. You're doing great, Priya. Keep going." As she walked away, Paul leaned back in his seat, feeling a sense of fulfillment he hadn't experienced in years. His role in the program had become more than just volunteering. It was a source of purpose and connection that had been missing from his life. That weekend, Angela hosted a community dinner at the health center to celebrate the success of the program. Participants and their families filled the room, sharing food, laughter, and stories. The walls, adorned with photos of the program's milestones, told the story of the bonds that had formed and the growth that had taken place. Paul arrived early to help set up, carrying trays of food into the center alongside Miguel and a few other volunteers. He had never been one for social gatherings, but tonight felt different. He felt like he belonged. As the evening unfolded, Angela stood at the front of the room, addressing the crowd. "I want to thank each and every one of you for making this program what it is today," she said. "It's not about any one person. It's about all of us, working together to build something stronger and better than we could have on our own." She paused, her eyes scanning the room. landing briefly on Paul, who offered her a small, encouraging nod. "This program is proof that change is possible," Angela continued. "It starts with small actions, listening, helping, sharing, and grows into something that touches lives in ways we can't always predict. Thank you for being part of this journey." As the dinner wound down, Angela found herself sitting with Paul at one of the tables, the hum of conversation filling the air around them. "You've become a cornerstone of this program, Mr. Mitchell," Angela said, her tone warm. "I hope you know how much you're appreciated." Paul chuckled, shaking his head. "I'm just a guy with a cab. You're the one who made all this happen." Angela smiled. "Maybe. But it wouldn't have grown the way it has without people like you. You remind me of something my mother used to say. The smallest acts of kindness can grow into the biggest blessings." Paul considered her words, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. "Your mother was a wise woman," he said, "and you've done her proud." As Angela left the dinner that night, she couldn't help but reflect on how far they had all come. The program had not only strengthened the community, but had also transformed her own perspective. Watching people like Paul, Sharon, and Miguel step into their strengths reminded her that growth was not just an individual journey, it was something that happened in connection with others. For Paul, the evening was another step in a journey he hadn't realized he needed. Driving home in his cab, he felt lighter, as though a weight he had carried for years was finally lifting. The mentorship program had given him a chance to make amends, but it had also given him something more: hope. The next morning, as the sun rose over the city, Paul parked his cab outside the community health center, waiting for his first ride of the day. The world felt a little brighter, and for the first time in a long while, he was looking forward to what lay ahead. The mentorship program at the community health center had grown into a tightly knit network of individuals committed to making a difference. For Angela Hayes, the success of the initiative was both rewarding and humbling. She often found herself reflecting on the many small moments of connection that had brought it to life, moments like Paul's apology, Sharon's newfound confidence, and Miguel's desire to make his shop more accessible. But one thing still lingered in Angela's mind: the deeper connection between growth and healing. She wondered if she could help others see that personal growth was not only about improving oneself, but also about repairing broken bonds and finding reconciliation. It was a thought that stayed with her as she planned the next phase of the program. One day, as Angela wrapped up a mentoring session at the health center, she spotted Paul standing near the entrance, chatting with Sharon. He waved to her as she approached. "Dr. Hayes," Paul said warmly. "Got a minute?" Angela nodded. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Paul hesitated for a moment, his expression unusually serious. "I've been thinking about what you said, that change starts with small actions, and I realize there's something else I need to do." Angela raised an eyebrow, curious. "What's that?" Paul took a deep breath. "I've spent so much time focusing on my own growth that I haven't thought about the people I've hurt along the way, people I shut out because of my own anger and fear. I want to make amends, but I don't know where to start." Angela's expression softened. "Acknowledging it is the first step," she said. "The next step is reaching out, even if it feels uncomfortable. Who's the first person that comes to mind?" Paul didn't hesitate. "My daughter." Paul's relationship with his daughter, Emily, had been strained for years. She had grown tired of his cynicism and his tendency to push people away. They had drifted apart, speaking only on holidays and the occasional birthday, and even those conversations felt superficial. But Paul missed her deeply. She was his only child, and the thought of losing her completely had become unbearable. The following evening, Paul sat in his cab outside Emily's apartment, rehearsing what he might say. He clutched his phone in his hand, debating whether to call her or simply knock on the door. Finally, summoning his courage, he stepped out of the cab and made his way up the steps. When Emily answered the door, her surprise was evident. "Dad?" she said, her tone a mixture of curiosity and caution. "What are you doing here?" Paul cleared his throat. "I was hoping we could talk," he said, his voice steady but hesitant. "If you've got a few minutes." Emily hesitated, then stepped aside. "Come in." Inside, they sat on opposite ends of the couch, the silence between them heavy with unspoken words. Paul took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. "I owe you an apology," he began, "for a lot of things, for pushing you away, for not being the father you deserved, and for letting my own pain get in the way of our relationship." Emily's eyes widened, her defenses softening as she listened. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," Paul continued, "and I realized I've been stuck in the past, holding on to anger and fear instead of focusing on what really matters. You matter, Emily, and I don't want to lose you." Emily's expression shifted, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Dad," she said softly, "I've wanted to hear this for so long. I've missed you." Paul felt a weight lift from his chest as Emily leaned over to hug him. In that moment, he knew that rebuilding their relationship would take time, but they had taken the first step together. The next day, Paul shared the experience with Angela over coffee at the health center. She listened intently, a proud smile spreading across her face as he recounted the conversation. "That's a big step, Mr. Mitchell," Angela said. "I'm glad you took it." Paul nodded, a sense of calm settling over him. "It felt right, and it made me realize how much I've let fear hold me back, not just with Emily, but with people in general. I don't want to live like that anymore." Angela leaned forward, her voice thoughtful. "You've come a long way, and the best part is, your growth is inspiring others. You're showing people that it's never too late to change." Paul chuckled, shaking his head. "Never thought I'd be anyone's inspiration, but if it helps, I'll take it." The ripple effect of Paul's transformation began to extend beyond the mentorship program. Inspired by his efforts to reconnect with Emily, other participants started reaching out to their own loved ones, mending fractured relationships and building new bridges. Sharon invited her estranged sister to one of the program's workshops, and Miguel began mentoring a young boy from his neighborhood who reminded him of himself as a child. Angela watched these connections form with a sense of awe. It was a testament to the power of vulnerability and the courage it took to face one's flaws. She began to see the mentorship program not just as an initiative, but as a movement one that had the potential to transform the community in profound ways. As the program continued to grow, Angela decided to host an event celebrating its success and sharing its impact with a broader audience. She worked with the health center staff to organize an open house, inviting participants, local leaders, and members of the community to come together. Paul volunteered to speak at the event, a decision that surprised even himself. Standing before a room full of people, he shared his journey with raw honesty, admitting his mistakes and celebrating the growth he had experienced through the program. "I used to think change was for other people," he said, "but this program taught me that change starts with one small step, and that step can lead to places you never imagined." The audience erupted in applause, and as Paul stepped down from the stage, Angela met him with a firm handshake and a warm smile. "You've done something incredible, Mr. Mitchell," she said, "and this is just the beginning." That evening, as Angela and Paul sat together reflecting on the event, they couldn't help but feel a sense of shared accomplishment. Their paths had crossed in an unexpected and, at times, painful way, but the journey had brought them both to a place of healing and hope. "You know," Angela said, her tone light, "if someone had told me a year ago that a taxi ride would lead to all this, I wouldn't have believed them." Paul chuckled. "Life's funny that way. Sometimes the smallest moments turn out to be the most important." Angela nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "And those moments remind us that no matter how divided things might seem, Connection is always possible. The mentorship program had grown into something far greater than Angela or anyone involved had initially imagined. Its success was no longer confined to the walls of the community health center. Stories of reconciliation, growth, and connection were spreading throughout the neighborhood, inspiring other organizations to reach out and ask Angela how they could replicate her work. For Angela, the journey had been transformative. She had always believed in the power of community and connection, but seeing it unfold before her eyes had deepened her conviction. As the program thrived, she realized that the effort wasn't just healing others, it was healing her as well. On a brisk autumn morning, Angela stood by the window of her apartment, staring at the shelf where the red hat rested. It had been a catalyst for so much: Paul's apology, the mentorship program, and countless conversations that had challenged assumptions and bridged divides. She picked it up, turning it over in her hands, reflecting on how something so simple could hold such complex meaning. Today, Angela had a meeting with the health center's board to discuss expanding the program citywide. It was an exciting opportunity, but it also meant navigating challenges on a larger scale. As she prepared, she felt a wave of gratitude for the people who had made it possible: Paul, Sharon, Miguel, Linda, Malik, and so many others who had embraced the program and made it their own. Meanwhile, Paul was preparing for a very different kind of day. For the first time in years, he was meeting his daughter, Emily, and her family for lunch. Their recent reconnection had been tentative but hopeful, and Paul was determined to rebuild their relationship one step at a time. He picked up a bouquet of flowers on his way to the restaurant, smiling at the thought of seeing Emily's two kids. They had only met him a handful of times, but he was eager to become a more present grandfather. As Paul parked his cab and walked into the restaurant, he spotted Emily waving at him from a corner booth. Her smile was warm, and Paul felt a surge of gratitude for the second chance they were giving each other. That evening, as the sun set over the city, Angela and Paul crossed paths once again. Angela had stopped by the community health center to finalize her plans for the citywide program, and Paul was there to drop off a participant who had just finished a session. "Dr. Hayes," Paul said, his face lighting up when he saw her. "Mr. Mitchell," Angela replied, smiling back. "How was your day?" Paul chuckled. "Busy, but good. I had lunch with my daughter and her family today. We're taking it slow, but it feels like we're getting somewhere." Angela's smile widened. "That's wonderful to hear. I'm glad you're finding your way back to each other." Paul nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I couldn't have done it without this program and without you. You gave me the chance to see things differently, and it's changed everything." Angela felt a lump rise in her throat. "You did the hard work, Paul. All I did was give you a place to start." They walked into the health center together, the hum of conversations filling the air. Angela led Paul to a bulletin board where photos of program participants and events were displayed. She pointed to a new section labeled "Stories of Connection," which featured quotes and testimonials from those whose lives had been touched by the program. Paul scanned the board, pausing when he saw Sharon's quote. "This program helped me find my voice again. I'm stronger than I thought I was." Nearby was a quote from Miguel. "I thought I was just running a shop, but now I see how much of a difference I can make in people's lives." Paul's eyes lingered on a final quote, one that felt deeply personal. "It's never too late to change. One small step can lead to places you never imagined." "That one's yours," Angela said softly, watching as Paul's expression shifted. He turned to her, a mixture of pride and humility in his eyes. "I guess it is," he said, his voice quiet. In the weeks that followed, the mentorship program expanded beyond the community health center, reaching other neighborhoods and inspiring similar initiatives across the city. Angela worked tirelessly to ensure that each new program carried the same spirit of empathy and connection that had defined the original. Paul continued to volunteer, his role evolving from driver to mentor. He shared his story at events and workshops, encouraging others to confront their biases and embrace growth. His honesty and relatability resonated with people from all walks of life, and he became a source of inspiration for many. One afternoon, Angela stood on the stage at a citywide conference, addressing an audience of community leaders, healthcare professionals, and volunteers. She spoke about the journey of the mentorship program, highlighting its successes and the lessons it had taught her. At its heart, she said, her voice steady and full of conviction, this program is about seeing each other. It's about recognizing the humanity in every person we meet and choosing to connect rather than divide. That's where real change begins. As she stepped down from the stage, Angela spotted Paul in the crowd, clapping alongside the other attendees. Their eyes met, and Angela felt a surge of gratitude for the journey they had shared. That evening, as Angela returned home, she placed the red hat back on its shelf. It no longer felt like a symbol of division or defiance. Instead, it was a reminder of everything she had learned, that small actions could lead to profound change, that people were capable of growth, and that even the most unlikely encounters could spark something extraordinary. Across town, Paul parked his cab for the night and leaned back in his seat, gazing out at the city lights. He thought about how far he had come from a man ruled by fear and assumptions to someone who actively sought connection and understanding. Both Angela and Paul knew their journeys were far from over, but they also knew they were not walking them alone. Together, they had shown that even the smallest acts of kindness and courage could ripple outward, touching lives in ways they might never fully see. And that, they realized, was what hope looked like. The city buzzed with life as Angela Hayes walked through the community health center one last time before the mentorship program's citywide expansion officially launched. She paused to look at the bulletin board covered with photos, quotes, and milestones, a visual testament to how far they had come. Every picture, every story, was a reminder of the power of connection and the courage it took to embrace change. Paul Mitchell, now a trusted leader within the program, stood nearby, speaking to a group of new volunteers. His voice carried the same sincerity and openness that had become his trademark. Angela smiled as she overheard him say, "It's not about being perfect. It's about showing up, learning, and trying every single day." The mentorship program was proof that even the smallest actions could create a ripple effect, changing lives in ways that were both personal and profound. Angela and Paul had started as strangers on opposite sides of an uncomfortable encounter, but their shared journey had transformed them and their community into something stronger and more united. As the day wound down, Angela and Paul found themselves sitting on a bench outside the health center, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky was streaked with hues of orange and pink, a quiet reminder of the beauty that came with endings and beginnings. "Do you ever think about how far we've come?" Angela asked, her voice soft. Paul chuckled. "Every day. I used to think people couldn't change, but now I know better, and I'm grateful for that." Angela nodded, her gaze thoughtful. Change is always possible. Sometimes it just takes someone willing to listen, to care, and to believe. They sat in companionable silence, the sounds of the city around them, a comforting backdrop. Both knew that their journey was far from over, but they felt a quiet certainty that the seeds they had planted would continue to grow, bringing hope and connection to countless others. If this story of transformation, resilience, and the power of human connection inspired you, consider how you can create your own ripple effect. Maybe it starts with a conversation, an act of kindness, or simply choosing to see someone in a new light. And if you enjoyed this journey, we invite you to join us for more stories, like this, stories that remind us of the strength we find in each other and the hope that comes from second chances. Hit subscribe to be part of a community that believes in the power of empathy, growth, and connection. Let's continue to learn, grow, and make the world a better place, one story at a time. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.